Welcome everyone to Color Commentary. We are your Pauper commentators, Michael Pechik and Adrian Guarzales. How's it going, Adrian?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm regretting everything. That sounds like the voice Gritty, the terrible mascot, would have.
That's what I was going for.
Great. I love Gritty. It's the best thing. All right, let's get into the upkeep before I get distracted by my love of Philadelphia sports mascots for a second here. So, as every week, we are brought to you in part by Original Magic Art. Original Magic Art has a variety of playmats, dice bags, art prints, and tokens from throughout the history of Magic, as well as history of the rest of the world as a whole. And they've got a bunch of really nice, high-quality products. They work directly with artists to bring new playmats of art that might not otherwise be available onto playmats and art prints, which is pretty neat. They're always getting new stuff into their store, and we are affiliates of theirs. So if you go to either originalmagicart.store/commentary or use the affiliate code commentary, all caps, both spelled as they are in the name of this podcast, you'll get 10% off your order, and we also get a little bit of kickback. So you're helping support the podcast, and on top of that, you're getting really cool tokens and other Magic accoutrement at a discounted price. Yeah, it works out for everyone. Once again, either originalmagicart.store or the affiliate code originalmagicart.store/commentary or the affiliate code commentary in all caps, both spelled as they are in the name of this show. What do you have for us, Adrian?
Well, this show is also brought in part by listeners like you. For just $1 an episode, you too can join our Patreon. We got a chat, and we got a little pre-show and post-show for you. So you're always covered.
Yeah, and this time there's a whopping 14 minutes of pre-show.
It's a lot of pre-show.
It is. And, you get to talk directly to us. You get your ideas over to us as quickly as possible. All right, before we get into our discussion for the week, I have an announcement. Kind of a big deal. And we don't usually kind of broadcast guests this early on, but next week we have a guest on the podcast, and the guest in question is a member of Magic's R&D team. We have Gavin Verhey on the podcast next week. We're recording on Thursday, so if you have any questions for Gavin, he is a senior designer at Wizards of the Coast, so this is your in. If you want to ask a question, we can't guarantee that they will actually get into the show. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of stuff that he can't talk about in public related to his job. So just know, if you ask a reasonable question, we'll try and pass it on. We'll try and make use out of it. But we are having Gavin Verhey on the show next week. I'm super excited about it. I feel like most people at home should probably be pretty excited about it. And yeah, get those questions in. You can send them to us on Twitter. Send them to our email. Adrian will get to all that at the end of the show. But Adrian,
I'm excited.
Yeah. Oh, it's going to be a blast. I'm very excited to get that insider perspective. All right, so Adrian, you came to me with a statement that you had seen on the internet. You don't quite remember where, but we're going to make an episode out of it. And I'd love you to inform the folks at home what this statement was, this general gist of an idea.
Well, it kind of surprised me because it just wasn't, I guess, what I traditionally think of as the truth. Someone mentioned that they don't consider the decks I traditionally think of being tier 1 as tier 1. They mentioned something along the lines of they thought that Familiars and Tron were tier 1 because those are the decks that, one, don't really care as much about interaction in the case of Familiars, or don't really need to devote a lot of slots to winning in the case of Tron, and can therefore utilize their mana advantage and their card advantage engines in order to see more from the deck. They also said Monarch and Gush decks weren't necessarily bad, just maybe not on the same level. Of course, depending on pilot as well. Affinity following after that, and then every other deck sort of in the pack behind. So it was just sort of took me by surprise a little because maybe I'm just a little bit out of touch, but I still think of Monarch and Gush decks as being really the top tier decks. So I thought that might make for an interesting discussion topic.
All right, so just going based off of pure numbers, I don't keep a spreadsheet of this stuff, so we're gonna just default to MTG Goldfish. I know it's not the most accurate. Right now, top 4 slots in the metagame: Koldatha Boros, Izzet Delver, Affinity, Tron. So by that metric, and actually I guess it probably should be a little bit different because it looks like Tron's getting split up into 2 things again. Tron should actually probably be number 1 by this thing's reckoning. So regardless, Tron is the only one of those 2 decks that this person mentioned that's actually in the top 10 of, in the top 4 of just places. Like it's not top 4, it's not top 8, it's just top 32 from a challenge or a 5-0 league. So already we're kind of having a discrepancy between some presented numbers and this theory. So I guess I'm a pretty big fan of Tron, and I'm not 100% sure that I fully agree with this, but let's kind of go down this rabbit hole here.
Yeah, and I think along the way, what we can also really have is a discussion, about the metagame as a whole. I don't know. I just thought it'd be an interesting discussion. So, sorry, it sounded like you had a thought you wanted to say.
Well, so I think that the analysis of like Tron and Familiars, are these over-the-top decks that can explode out of nowhere, and I do think that the most salient point of this whole thing is needing to devote less deck space to actually winning the game. I think that that's like a really salient point because, for example, if I go to look at Koldatha Boros, for example, like 14 creatures, then we've got 4 Galv Blasts, 4 Lightning Bolts. There's a lot of this deck that, while some of it serves dual purposes, a good chunk of this deck is actually devoted to being able to interact with your opponent in a way that wins the game. And I do think that that's an interesting point. The fact that Tron gets to go a little bit lighter on actual ways to win does give it a little bit more breathing room for playing spells to interact with the opponent. And I think the interesting thing is Familiars is very much on the opposite end of that spectrum, right?
Right. It just doesn't care what you're doing. It's looking to combo off as quickly as possible. And I think that this person, and I'm sorry if you're listening, I really just don't remember who said this, mentioned Elves in the same breath as well, where Elves is sort of the same thing, where it doesn't need to devote any slots to, removal or anything like that. It's just going to beat you to death with an Elf ball.
Yeah, so I think actually the interesting thing about those 2 combo decks is, while so Tron kind of devotes a very small package to actually winning the game and gets to play all this interaction, those other 2 decks are on the opposite end of the spectrum, where like they have a bunch of stuff that feeds into a combo. And I think with Elves, like ages ago we had the discussion about, is Burn a combo deck? And I think that Elves illustrates a similar type of combo deck where it doesn't care so much about which pieces it gets. Obviously, there are ones that are better or worse for the deck. Timberwatch Elf is much higher on the list of things you want to be able to play on curve than, Llanowar Elves. But they're all role players, and they'll all get you to a win somehow. And I think with Familiars, you have the other side of combo where it's like looking to assemble a specific subset of cards, and it has a bunch of stuff that just supports that game plan. Instead of Tron just being like, I'm going to play a pile of interaction, and then I'm going to play like the most minimal win cons I can.
I think the other thing, too, that I just recalled, and sorry, I wasn't trying to withhold this, specifically the card Distant Melody was mentioned, just because you can bury your opponent in card advantage if you're able to combo off with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, this might seem obvious for folks who've been playing the format for a while, but there's some really dumb card advantage engines in this format. I think that when it comes down to it, like, there's the base level sort of comparison of like Gush is probably better than the Skyfisher engine. But then you can go even deeper and be like, well, the fact that Tron gets to play like 7 mana spells on turn 3 potentially is an entirely different axis of I guess, mana advantage in that situation, but like they also get to play like Forbidden Alchemy and Mystical Teachings ahead of curve. So, I mean, at the end of the day, does this mean that the format just comes down to who can manufacture more card advantage more efficiently?
Honestly, Mike, we might be at that spot. Like, think of the other decks that I mentioned that I would say I more traditionally think as being tier 1. Monarch and Gush decks are all about generating card advantage. Almost every deck in the format is based around generating card advantage.
So I guess, is that now the be all end all? Like, is a deck's viability within this metagame hinged upon how efficiently it draws cards in its average game? How many, like, just velocity? Like, because that puts us in a weird place that's kind of akin to a lot of like, I'm thinking specifically in Vintage how decks play, where it's just like a flurry of tutors and cantrips to dig into something that makes your opponent dead. And I guess that's kind of where our format is wound up. But then you also just have like this anomaly of Tron. Like, Tron is not a fast deck. So I guess I'm trying to like reconcile like Tron. Like, when I think of Familiars, I think of like, this is a deck that can combo out really quickly.
Well, I guess Tron, what it has going for it is just that what I'm trying to say, it has the card advantage engine in spades. You know, its card advantage engine is much stronger than the other decks we've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, would you chalk that up more to the fact that it's more consistent in its card advantage and that it gets to have more?
I think that's what I'm really trying to say.
Yeah, because I was going to say, like, when it comes down to it, I think that if you're just looking in a vacuum, like I guess not a perfect vacuum, but like in the deck they go into, I think Distant Melody is obviously like,
oh yeah,
price per pound is just the most effective card draw spell just in terms of like volume. But I think it's interesting as well that like 2 out of those 3 decks, so Familiars, Tron, and Elves, 2 out of those 3 decks don't really play 1-mana cantrips. And I do think that's interesting because I have always felt that the cantrips are one of the most powerful things you can be doing in the format, especially in no small part because they usually lead into, hey, you can also play Gush in this deck.
Right, and Gush being what I consider to be one of the most powerful cards in the format.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just curious, like, because this came as a bit of a shock to you. Do you agree with this person and what they were saying? So
here's the thing. Yes and no. So I wanted to make it really clear they were not dismissing some of the other decks I mentioned outright. They, obviously if you're a noob to the format, I think you'll still do better. I think you'll still be beaten even if you're on one of those decks by someone who's playing, say, Is It Delver, just because Is It Delver is not, I'm not saying it's not a strong deck. So maybe from a theoretical standpoint, yes, I might agree, because when I thought about it, I thought, that actually makes a lot of sense. These decks are extremely powerful. They do have a lot of inevitability, or they go really fast. They do see a lot more cards than a lot of these other decks do. And the engine's a little bit easier to set up. Tron's also big strength is that it is a big mana deck, so it actually crushes Monarch decks, which we've discussed on this show in the past. So if you think of Monarch as being one of the best decks, and then Tron just beats it, then that's something to definitely consider. I think I was just the most thrown off because, like you said, the numbers don't really match.
Well, Tron, for example, has put up consistent numbers, and part of that, obviously, it would be great if I could have the time in my life to keep up a spreadsheet of every result. But like just the quick at a glance statistics that MTG Goldfish provides us with, seeing like 10% of the metagame being Tron decks of some variety, I think part of it is the fact that like you can put a lot of things into a Tron shell. Like we've seen Marasa Tron, we've seen Dinrova Tron, we've seen Stonehorn Dignitary Tron, we've seen Rhystic Tron, there was Teamer Tron back in the day, now it's Green Red Tron. Like I think that I'm not sure if I agree with the fact that like Tron would be the best, the most sturdy pillar of the format, if you will. But I kind of see where this person was coming from. Like the fact that that mana advantage is almost impossible to replicate for most decks, and the effect of like Tron just going over the top of other decks is quite real. Like if Tron hits Tron really quickly, like Condescends just become counter spells with upside, and Capsize Locks become a reality, or Ghostly Flickering something over and over to just grind your opponent into the dirt. And worst case scenario, like even if they don't hit Tron until late game, they're still usually constructed in the vein of a traditional blue-based control deck.
Right.
So I think it's that thing, like the best game out of Tron, I think, is probably better than, like, for example, we covered that blue-red control deck last week. And I think like the best game out of that blue-red control deck versus the best game out of Tron is miles of difference. I think the worst games they have are pretty similar. So I guess, does it come down to like how nutty your nut draw is? Is that the deciding factor?
I think there's something to be said for that too, but I really want to focus more on the card advantage part of Tron and the mana advantage part of Tron, which are its real strengths. Sure, having a turn 3 Tron is nice, but I think that, if we want to talk about like range of best draws, like would you consider the best draw of Tron to be just natural Tron on turn 3, or do you think that it can get away with setting up a little bit more?
I would honestly say, having played Tron a bunch over the years, I don't think the best games I've ever had with Tron are the turn 3 Tron games, because the deck has evolved to a point where it is not tuned, unlike its modern equivalent, to cast big 7 mana colorless spells on turn 3.
Right. It just can't. The cards just don't really exist in the format either.
Yeah, like we're in this weird place where like there's a very good Eldrazi at 8 that can close out games, and like there's also 7 mana spells with a colored mana cost in them somewhere. So you totally could have a game where it's like Tron Land 1, Tron Land 2, tap them for a Prophetic Prism, Tron Land 3, cast some 7-drop. Like that's a very realistic thing you can do. But I think it's the fact that like you are just playing a control deck, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you're operating on like this entirely different astral plane from your opponent. Your opponent is like, if it's turn 5 and I've hit 4 lands so far, and then I finally hit my 5th land and it's Tron, my opponent at most has 5 mana if they're not also on Tron.
Right, which is why we see Tron overpower mid-range decks very easily.
Yeah, like
for the listeners.
I think that fundamentally the fact that Tron breaks one of the golden rules of Magic, the 1 land a turn, in a way, but because its lands produce so much mana.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I think unless it was removed from the format, it's always going to be a role player. And I don't think that there's anything people can do about that. The thing I'm more curious about is, are combo decks just bad? Are combo decks just good in this format because we're not a Force of Will format?
I think combo decks have other problems aside from us not being a Force of Will format.
So what else do you think contributes to the fact that these combo decks are so difficult to interact with?
You mean from the other side?
Yeah, from the other side, because they're good. All these decks, as we mentioned before, are kind of good in a vacuum. But what is it that once you have to sit down and interact with it?
I guess I misunderstood the question a little. I guess like in the case of elves, it just has so many redundant pieces. Like the interaction is just not relevant unless you have it early enough. But then like, I don't know, Familiar surprised me in its resiliency, because I was playing against it as Delver, and I thought for sure my match would be good because I have counter spells and screds and all that stuff, and it just didn't amount to much. So I guess I see what you're saying a little, where the Force of Will would definitely help. I guess I'm still thinking of this from an angle of like Freed from the Real as a good combo deck, but we just don't live in that era of Pauper anymore, you know?
Yeah, like we're no longer in an era where a combo deck is the clear number 1 in my mind. I still don't think that like the valley between like combo decks and Tron decks is wide enough to say that it's definitively like, here's tier 1, everything else is worse than it. It's not that they're bad, it's just that they're worse. And I don't know. I definitely get where you're coming from with like we're not talking about freed from the real here, right? We're talking about decks that are very hyper focused and do what they do very well.
Combo decks are just better now, and in the past they weren't. So I guess I still think of combo as not being very good.
And the interesting thing is most of these decks haven't changed that much. Like Godfarer's Faithful provides a little bit of resiliency for the Familiars deck, but Elves hasn't gotten anything really since Lead the Stampede. And I also don't generally like Elves right now by MTG Goldfish stats is sitting at like 4% of the winning metagame.
Is that high?
It's the 7th most popular deck according to this. Although if we're combining these two Tron entries, it's the 6th. But it's below Burn. And I don't think that I'm willing to chalk up 100% of that to being like, yeah, they're similarly costed online. Burn is 20 tickets. Elves is 29 tickets. Like, that's not a huge gulf in between those two. So I don't think you can chalk that up to just Burn is cheap online, which is definitely a thing in the past. Like, it is cheap online and that is good. But I don't know, because then we get into like interesting things like, is Familiars actually tier 1 and it's just that it's a very difficult deck to play on the online?
I think that's definitely part of it. Maybe in theory, it is the number 1 deck in the meta, just because you don't have to worry about, the case this person was making. You don't have to worry about playing removal spells, playing bad creatures. I don't know. It was a really interesting point. So maybe in a vacuum, yes, but because it is, like you said, much harder to play online, that makes its performance in the MTG Goldfish rankings suffer.
And I mean, we have also just now sort of had these high profile finishes like the Rags to Riches
Dragons.
Yeah. Like 420 Dragon has been piloting this deck for a while, but we haven't seen like multiple top 8s or in this case someone winning I don't know how big this last Rags to Riches was, but probably at least a 50-person tournament, right? They're usually about that size. Like, and I think specifically I'm gonna forget the person's name, but the person who won Rags to Riches has won it before. I think it's Travis Hoekstra. I may be incorrect in that, but he's shown up with a lot of decks that he's piloted very, very well. And I think that it shows something that someone who has this level of repeated success has chosen to swap to something that I don't think I've ever seen him play on one of these streams or heard of him playing on one of these streams. So Travis Holbra, that's what it is. There we go. But I think that's when you see one of these sort of higher profile, if you will, like big old heavy air quotes, we're still popper here, right? But I think when you see one of these higher profile players, even despite the criticisms of Rags to Riches legality list, blah, 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 not going to get into it, I still think that points to there's something more to this deck than a lot of people are recognizing. And I think that I think that the person who made this statement that kicked off this whole discussion, I think there's merit to that. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I think that pointing out the axes on which those decks really excel does point to what makes this format tick. Because
yes,
we've talked about a bunch of brews lately, right? And there's certain things that we always kind of return to, like there's not enough card draw, how does this match up against X, Y, and Z deck? Like those have to be unfavorable matchups. And the two options that this sort of hypothesis is presenting are, go big or just kill your opponent and don't care about what they're doing. So I guess with you as someone who's played Affinity and Monarch extensively, do you and you've put in your time with Blue Red Delver, I guess if you had to, gun to head, produce a tier 1 list, what would your list look like? Like your collection of decks?
I feel like my tier 1 list would be Izzet Delver for sure. I'm not sure how good Monarch is anymore, to be quite honest with you.
It's still putting up numbers. Like, it's still 6% of the winning meta.
Oh, then I guess it's good. I would definitely include. I don't know. I just still feel like oh, what's it called? The other combo deck.
Inside Out.
Tyos Tribe. Yeah, I think that would definitely make my tier 1 list. So that Delver, I just think the Gush decks are still so strong. You know, I've said that before, and then I think that Inside Out combo uses it the best. I think also I put Mono Blue Delver up there. Honestly, I know that it's gotten a lot less popular lately, but it's still a really solid deck. It still puts up good finishes, and part of me just likes the fact that you can play cards like Spire Golem and not have to worry about getting red.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly. We have had the eternal struggle about mana is bad in our format, so that definitely earns it a point in its favor.
What would your tier list look like?
I don't think mine would include Inside Out.
Oh yeah.
So I think we've gotten to a point where people have, like, there was a period where people weren't running much tech for Inside Out, and I think the fact that Inside Out is a very glass cannon-y combo, as opposed to something like Elves, which oftentimes can bounce back from even like getting electricaried when they lose a ton of their board, just because of the nature of the deck and the card advantage engine that it runs in the form of both Lead the Stampede and Distant Melody.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the fragileness of it and the fact that people have figured out like this is not an unbeatable part of the format, like I don't think it's where it once was. Like the fact that people can now comfortably run main deck Serrated Arrows crimps in on how good that deck is. I still think that in a vacuum, just goldfishing it, A+ deck, A absolute plus. But I think my tier 1 would probably be, at this point, Tron is, I think, solidly a tier 1 deck. I think it's proven time and time again that it has what it takes to go the distance. I think Elves is a tier 1 deck. I do think that Blue-Red Delver is still a tier 1 deck. I think I prefer it a little bit because it does shore up some of the issues that Mono Blue has always had. And I think I'd also potentially include Familiars now that we're seeing it on the uptick again. I think that now tier 2 is, or tier 2, tier 1.5, whatever you want to refer to it as, the second like wave of decks below the absolute all-time home runs. I think it's populated by stuff like Stompy and White-Black Pestilence, and even like Forbidden Alchemy decks are now like in that second tier, because I just don't think that I think the card advantage that they were working with at the time when they were doing well was enough. I think that being able to have this wacky riff on impulse that powered out your anglers was enough. I don't think it is anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've sort of seen that with the blue-black one-drop deck too, where just powering out anglers is good in theory, but doesn't. But you know, that deck sort of, I think, is after its flashpoint.
Yeah, I think that one was a good idea taken to the extreme, and it was, once people figured out that it was a deck, it lost a lot of its luster.
Which, to be honest, is exactly what happened to Death Shadow, which is what that deck is modeled after. So, kind of interesting.
Yeah, but I think it illustrates a good point. Like, it leaned in on the things that work in this format. Efficient card draw, free spells, and then
cheap
undercosted threats. Yeah, like, I think it leaned in on the things that make a deck generally perform well in this format, but I think it maybe took it a step too far. I think it just kind of leaned in a little bit more than it might have wanted to.
And I know I derailed you. I'm sorry. I just wanted to throw that out there since you were talking about turboing out anglers.
Oh, no. I think that's a completely relevant point. I guess it's weird because in the past we've compared this format to like a Legacy Light, right? And I think that we're starting to see shades of what admittedly little I know of Vintage, where like card advantage is one of the primary ways in which your deck will beat out the other deck.
Turbo Xerox.
Yeah, like not to the extreme of like Ancestrals, a pile of Git probes, like all these goofy things powered out by Moxen. Like not to that extreme, but I think that we're entering an era where at the end of the day, your card advantage engine is what you live and die by.
Yeah. I mean, and the reason and it's sort of harken back to that, the deck archetypes are named after their card advantage engines. If you think about it, Gush decks, Monarch decks, and Tron, if you think of the mana advantage as being a form of pseudo card advantage.
Yeah, I think that I do think it's interesting that we're seeing this shift, and I don't think it's a bad one. Like, I actually think that the format is going into really interesting places, and the fact that we're even seeing discussions like this indicates that we're sort of reaching a point of maturity for the format that I'm happy to see. I guess I hate to bring this up, but there's a phrase that I have grown to loathe to describe our format, and a bunch of people insist on referring to our format with, is this format actually a place to brew anymore?
I don't think it has been for a long time.
Yeah,
I think people call us a brewer's paradise, and I don't know if I've ever really agreed with that, to be honest with you. And I think I've made that opinion pretty clear in the past.
I think there was an era where like there was space to brew and not like have a terrible time, but I think that we're getting to a point where decks have become streamlined.
We were really hype on that blue-black one drop list, right?
Mm.
And now that deck's sort of been figured out. But like that's what you got to bring to the table if you're going to be brewing in this format. And even then, your deck might have its moment in the sun. People will figure it out, and then it's over. The last time I think there was a really big breakthrough in the format as far as like a totally quote-unquote new archetype goes is when Is It Delver came out.
And even that wasn't a huge departure. Like it still takes the same guiding principles of like,
I guess Monarch too.
Yeah,
but
I mean, Monarch was an entire new can of worms. That was, like that definitely is a huge departure, because the issue that plagued the blue-red decks was always that their card advantage engine was slow, and Monarch helped that out a good chunk. But I think that blue-red Delver wasn't that much of a departure.
They just need a little boost.
Yeah, it was more just like a, hey, there's a way that we can actually splash and pretend that we're like playing with good mana. Like, we're just going to splash this really tiny red package, and if it works, it works, and it works.
I think Augur is what made it so good. But yeah, like that's what you got to bring to the table when you're brewing in this format. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like you have to be willing to put in work and like not screw around. Like
So yeah, my long and short of it is that I don't think Pauper's a brewer's paradise. I don't think it really ever was or has been for a long time. You're talking about that doesn't mean I don't think the format's not healthy. I don't think the format's I don't think it's not growing. But like, think about the hoops you have to go through to brew in other formats, right? I think of the power level of those cards relative to Pauper's. Like, you get so many cool build around me cards and other rarities that you just don't get at common.
And I think like one of the things that, now that you bring up other formats, like at the end of the day, in other formats, you can run like a handful of cards that make up the brewery part of your deck, and then just run a solid backbone of another deck. I feel like that's not the case in Pauper. I feel like
it's true in Vintage or Legacy or even Standard.
Yeah, like you can kind of just go, okay, so I've got like 50 good cards, and I'm throwing in this like 10 card like weird engine, and I'm going to see if it works. And you'll probably do okay because you're playing 50 out of your 60 cards as good cards. I think the issue is that like the Pauper build-arounds are just so incredibly fringe. Like, I'm just going to pick one off the shelf, like Defender combo. Like, Vent Sentinel requires you to play some heinous cards. Like, I don't think that Overgrown Battlement should be something you're looking to play in this format ever. And that's the way that you can turbo out that strategy. And I think the fact that we don't get build arounds anymore of the grade of like, Tortured Existence, or I guess Kolothoboros doesn't really have one of those, or the Tron lands even. Like, I'd consider those a build around. And I think that we're just not getting those effects anymore. And as a result, brewing is limited. Like, if you can brew a sweet Delver deck that follows through on like principles of like tempo oriented gameplay, cool. That's great. That'll like probably do okay. But I think if you're just coming in and you're like, I want to brew a funky like Aristocrats deck, I just don't think it's going to work.
Yeah.
And I think like, as much as we have been champions of like the weird and offbeat, I think there's a point where we do have to come to terms with the fact that like, this is a somewhat solved format. And I don't, at the end of the day, think that's a bad thing, but there are people out there who will. There are definitely people who view this format and have for a long time as a place to brew things. And I think if you're looking to play this format competitively, you need to come to terms with the fact that like, there are some very, very good decks that have been polished over thousands of hours by hundreds of players endlessly iterating on it. I think.
Yeah, please see our brewing episode. In fact.
Yeah. We've covered this a few times, but like, I know. Marshall Sutcliffe talked about what he calls the Great Machine, which is basically this whole concept that the moment Magic Online gets a hold of something, it's just going to be iterated on so many times that you could never hope to test your own brew as well as Magic Online could. Yeah. And I think the big thing is you need a good brew for people to start doing that.
Oh, you know what? I will correct myself. I think the latest brew that I remember that really made a splash. Well, actually, let me take the other tack. I'm starting to think about it a little. I'm going to come out in defensive brews.
All right. Now, what do you got for me? What do you got for me in terms of brews?
All right, let me tell you what I got for you in terms of brews, Mike. Is it Delver? We already talked about that one though. Mono White Heroic. How do we feel about that deck? That's a Reddit deck. That's a brew.
Okay. I see that.
I'm not trying to say like these decks are, super awesome or, super powerful. I think the heroic deck can get really out of hand though. I want to say that they're decks people are playing. Let's go with that. These are decks people are playing. They weren't just a flash in the pan by one person. Sort of to your point where Moto got a hold of them, and then they were able to sort of grow from there. Are we going to be seeing Mono White Heroic win a challenge anytime soon? Probably not. But the deck exists. People play it, and it is a deck that was brewed by the community. So that's one of my big counterpoints. And there are a lot of subtle little tweaks that get passed along through decks. So I think really what we're trying to say, and maybe what you're trying to say too, is there's a certain level you got to bring to the table, and it's not like the format is totally dead. Like things get little wrinkles get worked out, but you have to be bringing that power level to the table in order for it to make a splash in the format.
Okay, let me come back to you with something that we actually briefly mentioned in the pre-show. There was a deck that went 5-0 last week, and it's basically red deck wins, right? Our trusty, 1 and 2 mana 2/2s, some amount of pump and burn, except this one just takes it to the nth degree. So this deck, 60 card deck, tosses in, obviously we've got like Foundry Street Denizen, Gitu Lava Runner, Bushwhacker, Burning Tree Emissary, the usual suspects. But then it also runs 4 Street Wraith, 4 Gitaxian Probe, 4 Manamorphose. So it's shaved the deck size by 12. And then it's also running things like Giant Baiting and Fire Blast, just these big sort of finisher knockout cards. And I think that this kind of highlights what you need to do to make a brew work. Like this deck has radically altered what it would look like in order to just go, sure, like let's just optimize the ever-loving hell out of this deck and spare no expense in terms of like cutting corners. And that's the thing, like this still does not look as attractive to me as most of the Tron lists that I see. Like this feels very much like a deck that some of the hands are just not going to work, And I think that that's kind of the catch. Like, these other decks are good because people have played them so long that like they just work. Like, you can pick up a Tron deck, and if you've played a Tron style control deck before, you'll know what you're doing. Whereas this deck is like, yeah, it's a mono red deck, but it's also like running a ton of like cantrip, just empty air cards. And I don't know. It's a weird place for our format to be in, where like this is what a brew looks like.
Well, let me hit you with this retort. What about the Lava Runner? The way that Lava Runner has now overtaken Burn. And granted, people have moved away from playing terrible cards like Ataxian and Probe Manamorphose in those decks, but that innovation is stuck. So there's room to innovate, maybe.
I think there's room to innovate. I just don't think that like, I think the Brewer's Paradise idea is an absolute pipe dream, and I don't think that you could honestly have described it to me as a Brewer's Paradise post like 2014, and I would have actually agreed with you.
I think the term paradise is really where we're getting hung up, maybe. Somewhere between a wasteland and a paradise. Let's call it a brewer's tundra.
All right. There you go. But
it's somewhere
like,
between totally dead and alive.
But like look for example at Modern right now, which I admittedly do not follow. And Modern is having this kind of period where like some
Modern
people are not a fan of it, but like it's open.
Yes, I see. Okay, now we're on the same page now. I think that you and I were maybe approaching what the term brewers, if we're going to use the term Brewer's Paradise, I think you and I were sort of coming to this with two different approaches, but I see exactly what you're saying now. When you compare it to a wide open format like Modern, yeah, it starts to look pretty thin.
Yeah, like I'm like just casually looking over at like the MTG Goldfish page for Modern, I'm seeing Burn, Azorius Control, Jund, Dredge. All right, so 4 decks in, I've got an aggro deck, a control deck, a mid-range deck, and a combo deck. And then Mono Green Tron combo, Bant Spirits, aggro, Hollow One, aggro combo, Grixis Death Shadow, aggro. Like, there are just a pile of different decks here. Like, there's Mardu Pyromancer, Hardened Scales, Storm, Jeskai Control, Grixis Whir, which I'm assuming this is Krark Clan Ironworks. No, it's not. It's some weird prison deck.
Yeah,
okay.
There you go. It's some weird prison deck that you don't know the name of because that person made it up.
Well, it's on the first page of results, so it's clearly doing something right. But I think that like this is more what I envision when I hear Brewer's Paradise, or something like I don't know if you've seen any of the content for like Arena does the Singleton event some weekends.
Yeah, those actually look pretty sweet.
Yeah,
I haven't played it yet, but it looks sweet.
But that's a format I consider like a Brewer's Paradise, because it's like, sure, you know what the good cards are, but like no one's competitively brewing it. Like, I don't think you can play in a competitive format and hope for it to be a Brewer's Paradise. And I think the best you're going to get is something what Modern looks like right now, where a bunch of different decks are doing well. And there is room for innovation, but like it's people iterating on previously known designs. And even then, like Hollow One was last year that someone came up with that? And like Mardu Pyromancer's been around for maybe a year. It's I think just looking at these two in comparison, even just the images that MTG Goldfish auto pulls for them, in comparison, there's like a couple of repeats. The moment I go to look at Pauper decks and I start scrolling, there's 5 images of Preordained just bundled up together. Like, I think at the end of the day, Pauper is still a good format, but I don't think that it has openness or that much room for like a brand new thing.
Sure.
I think that at the end of the day, we're always just going to see tweaks on things. We're going to see variations and iterations on things. And I kind of think that's okay. Like,
I agree.
I don't think we need to like ban anything right now, just because the format is feeling itself out.
Oh yeah, I don't think we need to ban anything either.
No, like I think we just have to understand that we now live in a different world than we did even when we started this podcast. Like, when we started this podcast, I think that the format was more open. I think there were more options of decks you could play. but we didn't have Burning Tree Emissary. This was pre-Drake. This was pre-Elvish Vanguard. This was pre all sorts of different things. Like Blue Red Delver wasn't even a thing at this point. Ash Barons wasn't in the format. All these great cards that have since been introduced into the format weren't there when we started this podcast. And I think the format has fundamentally changed over the years, and it's exciting.
I'm excited.
Yeah. And we even got a somewhat tangentially related question from a fan who asked if we can boil decks down to Gush, Tron, and Skyfish or Affinity, whatever. Can we also boil down the strategies that are effective against them? And we can, but I
don't think we're that rock, paper, scissors is my short answer.
I don't think we are. I think there are a handful of like those 70-30 matchups in the format, but I think by and large we're starting to reach a point of homeostasis where there are decks that exist that are good in this format that will continue to be good. But I don't think that we're not, I'm expecting to play a lot of, is it Delver? So I'll pick out this specific meta deck that's just gonna, put it in the dirt. We're not to that point. And also, I don't know if you've noticed, like, it used to be that like the MTG Goldfish results were pretty heavily weighted to the first few positions. Mm-hmm. It's kind of evening out over time. Like there's a big old swath of like 1% to 2% of the metagame, and then like a good chunk of it is like the 4% to 6%.
Do you think that's a result of the league? I mean, of the reporting restrictions?
Yes, that probably could be a bit of it. Like, we've voiced many times on this podcast our feelings about Wizards of the Coast restricting information to its players. But I don't think that's the only factor. I think that we're getting to a point where things are evening out. I think we are finally recovering from the many tumultuous things that have gone on in this format over the past couple of years, and I think we're in a good place. So at the end of the day,
me too.
Is Tron just tier 1? I think it is. I'm always going to think Tron's tier 1.
Well, that was a very roundabout way of explaining that opinion to me, but thank you. I liked it.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something where
Tron is really sweet.
Tron is really sweet. It is always going to be an enjoyable deck to play because you kind of get to slot whatever into it.
Right.
And I got to play Selling if I can't just play Blue-Black Teachings. So, although that is making its own minor comeback in its own way. All right. Before we head out, do you have anything else to say? And I'm just going to remind folks at home about Selling if you don't.
Mike, we've been doing this show for a long time now, and you're the greatest co-host that a guy could hope to have.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very appreciative. I'm very appreciated. You're a great co-host as well.
Yeah, I bet you did. I bet you didn't see that positivity coming.
No, I didn't, but it's appreciated. All right, just a reminder.
Yeah, go ahead with your thing.
Before we head out here, we mentioned it at the top of the show. I do want to mention it again just because we do really value your input, and this is a very limited chance that we have here. We're having Gavin Verhey of Wizards of the Coast R&D on the show. You have until the morning of Thursday, the 25th of October, to get us questions. If it's not in by then, it's unlikely we're going to be able to run it by him and get his approval on the question. We obviously are going to choose if your question's good or not, and good enough to even get put in front of him, but please send us in your questions. This is a really neat chance for us to get an opinion on our format from someone who makes the game. So we definitely appreciate anything you send our way. We have questions already lined up for him, but we value your input as fans. All right, Adrian. I think we've hit that point in the evening. You want to take us out of the show?
Thanks for joining us today. This podcast is brought to support of our patrons. Please consider supporting us if you like the show. I'd like to give a special shout out to one of my favorite patrons, Chuggins. I just love that name. Check the video in the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you, if you're listening to this on a platform with reviews, they're always appreciated as they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list or an idea for a topic, you can contact us either via our website or you can email us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Please send us those Gavin questions. Special thanks to my LGS, Pat's Games, and Mike's LGS, JP Comics, and of course, L. You can find our theme song, Quantitative, and other great tracks over at soundcloud.net/ELLELLELL. Till next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.